Hello everyone, and thank you for joining another session of our CSR Talks. My name is Clémentine Gauthier. I'm the Group SVP of Corporate Social Responsibility at Teleperformance. And today I'm very happy to receive Louis Lagoutte, who is a Regional Director of Fundraising for Europe at One Tree Planted. Hi Louis, how are you doing?
Very well, Clémentine. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk a bit about this important topic. I'm looking forward to it.
So One Tree Planted is a very renowned association specialized in reforestation projects. We are very happy to have secured a partnership with you for a year or so, where at Teleperformance we are funding the plantation of more than 500,000 trees across many regions of the world, in India, in the Philippines, in the US, in Portugal, and also in the Andes. So we often talk about how reforestation and tree planting is important for carbon sequestration, but today we really wanted to focus on its impact on biodiversity, which is very important and core to your job at One Tree Planted. So Louis, could you explain us a little bit on why and how is tree planting so important for biodiversity?
Absolutely. And first of all, you're completely correct in saying that, we're talking so much about carbon, about net zero, and we're talking a lot about tree planting in terms of this, in relation to how the trees will sequester carbon. But it's also really important to not just consider this when we're planting trees, because one could be planting trees that'll be sequestering a lot of carbon, but if you're not doing it right, and if you're not taking into account what that ecosystem needs, then you could actually be making the ecosystem worse. But trees and forests are really important for our global biodiversity. Forests are home to most of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. It's where the richest concentrations of species can be found, because they are really the most productive land ecosystems. With, in the Yasuni National Park in Ecuador, there are more species of amphibians in 1 square kilometer than in the whole of Europe. Just to give an idea of the kind of amazing kind of richness of species, especially in tropical forests. So they provide habitat for so many species, huge range of species. The tree canopies create all of these different layers. So you have habitats up in the top of the trees. You have habitat underground where the roots are making habitat when the trees fall over. That creates opportunities for young plants to come through in the light. Whereas without the trees, you would just have this kind of bare land, or you would have a mix of shrubs. Trees also very important, and forests, in the ecosystem services they provide. So ecosystem services is services, for example, that forests have by holding down water when the rain falls, getting water into the ground, into aquifers, providing shade, which means that in certain places where it could get very hot, and the trees will kind of protect, for example, the undergrowth. It'll protect species from more extreme weather as well. And they do play a crucial role in carbon sequestration, which is obviously going to hopefully mitigate some of the effects of climate change and slow it, which then also will mitigate that impact on biodiversity. But most importantly, really, it's just that trees are the kind of core building block for forests, which are one of the world's most important ecosystems. And so, when you take an ecosystem approach and you're looking at planting trees to really restore that ecosystem, then that will benefit the biodiversity. But you have to look at it as a kind of whole ecosystem, not just as kind of planting one species in isolation or doing one particular action in isolation.
Very interesting. Could you give us maybe more examples on how specifically you design projects to maximize all of this impact on biodiversity? How do you do it?
Absolutely. So the first part is that when we're doing projects all over the world, we're working very closely with local partners on the ground who have that local expertise, who've been working in the area for a long time. Sometimes that's working with indigenous groups. Sometimes it's working with local NGOs. But the first thing which is really important to consider is you have to look at the baseline for that particular place and ecosystem, right? Is it meant to be a forest? Is the first question. We want to plant trees, obviously, wherever they're needed, but there are some places that are meant to be grasslands, right? There are some places that are meant to be wetlands. And so it's really important that we're planting trees in places which are meant to be forests, which were forests. Next, you have to look at what tree species are being planted. The last thing you want to do is create a monoculture of non-native species. And some tree planting is not really creating forests. It's almost just creating agriculture, right? So we're looking at native tree species and a real rich mix of species, because then the system is much more resilient. If you have a forest which is dominated by just one type of tree, and then maybe a kind of disease comes through, and those trees unfortunately are killed, then the forest kind of loses a lot of its trees. Whereas if you have a big mix, then it's much more resilient to changes. When we're doing these projects, we're also considering the ecological needs of the species in that space. So what that means is, when we're planting trees, you can be strategic. For example, you can have extra impact instead of just planting, for example, a few, several hectares of forest just in isolation with nothing around. Maybe if you look at what is already in the landscape, for example, maybe there's existing protected areas. If you decide, okay, we're going to plant trees, but we're going to use them to connect up these two existing fragmented habitats to create a wildlife corridor, then that has a real spillover extra impact, because it helps species in these two places to travel from one area to the other, which can help them to find more genetically diverse mates, which can help them to move. And that really will help the ecosystem in general. So designing, looking at what's already there, strengthening it, rather than just kind of doing something from scratch, if possible. Also, sometimes it's about including, planting not just the trees, but also creating an understory. So vegetation, which will grow underneath, which will also provide maybe food for certain species.
Mm-hmm.
The other important part is also engaging local communities, local stakeholders. And that might be, for example, and this is for the biodiversity, and that might be, for example, because of preventing, for example, poaching, creating employment opportunities as rangers, as wildlife monitors. I was visiting one of our projects in India, in the Sundarbans, which is these mangrove forests in the far east of India, near the border with Bangladesh. And it was very interesting, because all of the people who were working there as rangers, showing us around, they used to be working, they used to be poaching and hunting on that land. So the conservation project had given the opportunities to take them out from something destructive into something constructive, and given them employment as well. But then the last part, which is really key, is to monitor and evaluate the projects and what progress has been made, so that we can learn how to do things better. You can identify best practice and inform the kind of strategies which we're taking forward. There's some really kind of interesting new methods for measuring biodiversity that are kind of starting to come about. A very interesting one is called eDNA. And what that does is, by taking just water from inside an ecosystem, there are some companies now who can find in that water, using eDNA, traces of almost all the species in that particular ecosystem, because everything kind of flows through the water, whether it's coming from the waste or skin cells or anything else. So that can then be used to measure the biodiversity in a particular system. So there are these exciting new metrics. And something which is kind of just coming about in the kind of international space is, when there was the COP in Montreal, which was the biodiversity COP, there was it was the COP for biodiversity. And what came out of it now is maybe a new kind of biodiversity credit. So like we have carbon credits, now people are saying, okay, we need to have a biodiversity credit. It's going to be very interesting to see what this means. How do you measure a biodiversity credit? What is kind of the baseline? Who's doing that measurement? And I think it has to be done right. And you still want to make sure that most of the money is actually going to fund the projects themselves, and not, just to get on the kind of verification. But that also is very interesting, and it's very encouraging overall that people are talking more about it.
Indeed, that gives very hopeful and optimistic perspectives. And in general, in your project, so you described what you try to do and how you design. Are there specific things that you avoid because they're destructive or not conclusive for biodiversity?
Yes, absolutely. Well, one that I already mentioned is really avoiding tree planting in places which are not meant to be forests. we're losing a lot of forests, but also we're losing a lot of wetlands, we're losing a lot of grasslands, we're losing a lot of peat bogs. So those places need to also, we need to have a mosaic of ecosystems. That is the most healthy, right? You need to have a diversity of these ecosystems. But another thing is the species selection. So really no planting of invasive species that could spread, that could overtake the natural vegetation, outcompete the native plants. Minimizing and eliminating the use of pesticides and herbicides. That's because they will harm insect life, they will harm all sorts of other biodiversity. And then completely avoiding any types of monoculture. So as I said, planting a diversity of species. They lack biodiversity, they lack resilience, and it's not really a forest. There's no forests in true natural forest where you just have straight lines of all the same trees. So avoiding monocultures and doing very targeted planting of trees. So we're avoiding kind of just planting trees where they're not going to have an additional impact. We're looking at additionality. So those are really the key things to avoid in order to make sure that we get the kind of maximum benefit.
One of the projects we are supporting is based in the Philippines. And I believe that the focus on biodiversity is pretty key. Could you maybe give us some highlights on this project in the Philippines you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So this particular project is it's restoring habitat for the native Philippine eagle, which is a particularly beautiful species, and it's working with indigenous communities in the province of Aurora, which is in the northeastern Philippines. This area, the lands which we're planting on here have been identified by the community themselves as areas which are degraded and which need enrichment. And all of the tree species being planted here, and there's many, they're all, many of them are endemic to the Philippines, which means that they're found nowhere else. And a lot of them are also listed as endangered by the IUCN. So some tree species are really kind of in danger of being lost completely. So we're making sure to plant them, as well as also some species which maybe will benefit the local community, so that there's kind of an interest. So maybe some which have, some commercial value as well, maybe some fruit trees or nut trees. But yeah, the really nice thing about this project is it's home of the Philippines eagle. And this is critically endangered. And there's also in this species going to be hornbill, which is, it's kind of a bird. It's a bit like the toucan in South America. It's the equivalent. It's got a huge beak. Hawk eagle, flying fox. So it's a very, very biodiverse kind of area. And yeah, that's why this project in particular is going to be really exciting. And it's restoring 400 hectares, which is also a really big area of land. And we're hoping that as the time goes on, we're going to be able to expand this project and maybe see the return of some of these species.
Thank you so much, Louis, for all of these insights. It was extremely interesting, and I'm sure that you were an inspiration for all of the ones who listen to us. So thank you again for coming today. Thank you to the ones who are listening to this podcast. If you want to find more about our work and about One Tree's work, please follow the link in the description. Or you can also check, of course, Teleperformance website and One Tree website.
Super. Thank you for having me, Clémentine. It's a real pleasure.